Oh, and I made it with you to the front. So this is good here. We love it when technology works. Again, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world that you're calling from or joining us in today. It's with my great pleasure here to introduce our first keynote speaker of the morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are. And that's Dr. Vijay Kumar. He's the executive director of the MIT Abdul Latif Jameel World Education Lab. And I am so excited to hear from Dr. Kumar today because of the innovation and the creativity that occurs within this World Education Lab. And so as we put everyone's bios out there, you can always find them on the STEM Leadership Alliance website there. But he's really done so much around information technology and media services into education, and just the connections, his fascination in terms of his background and bringing this all together and bringing it to life. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Kumar because we want to learn more about what's going on at the MIT J-WEL there. So go right ahead. I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you for the gracious introduction. Good morning, everybody. What shall I say? We are ready to blast off, I guess, and which is the appropriate term today. I want to start off with a very, very old line. I consider myself an educational futurist. Actually, my doctoral work was in future studies in education, and hence the title and design. So you'll see the sense of the future, at least in all my comments, but future not in just a sense of dreaming up possibilities, but seeing how we can make future possibilities more real for others, because that's what futurists do. But the old line that I'm referring to is Yogi Berra's old line, which is so true today, which is the future ain't what it used to be, because it is now and here, as all the copy for this very important event pointed out, we are between two, very seemingly normal blast-offs to space, the one that happened the day before and the one that is going to happen later on the week. And these are, I should say, amateurs blasting off into space. And so, and you'd say, what's next? And the next could well be field trips for our kids, field trips which are to different planets, and that's no longer inconceivable. Or, space camp is no longer a movie, but a real thing. So that is sort of the present or the future that we are living in. So I have, as Kelly pointed out, very, very, fortunate to lead this lab called the World Education Lab, whose business I'll talk about. But we are really about bringing educational innovation for transformation around the globe, thinking of, bringing digital learning, the research and practice, innovative research and practice, and convening communities to work with in order to co-construct, co-create possible futures that will transform education with a sharp eye on, how do we really bring quality learning opportunities at scale. I am going to switch over to some slides, and so bear with me as I do this. I hope you're all able to see the slides that are coming up. So, and the lab actually is situated in open learning at MIT, which has, where open courseware, many of the initiatives that we've been associated with or familiar with over time, at least I have been. LinkedIn told me a couple of weeks ago that I've been at MIT for 25 years in various roles, but mostly focusing on educational technology and educational innovation. And what progressively we've been able to do and bring to now J-WEL is to look at how can we amplify the kinds of things that we believe are important for education through the judicious application of technology? How might we extend these possibilities to communities that we typically don't serve or remain underserved? And my various roles at MIT, both looking at MIT and extending MIT, has been in that kind of work, leveraging education technology for education innovation, for bringing quality learning opportunities around the world. And all this is the purview of open learning right now, when I'm an associate dean. But this is the work that the lab, and it's very germane to today's topic. And I was just thinking, given that we're all talking about space nowadays, with the two blast offs that I referred to, which are bookending this particular event. Some time ago, in one of J-WEL's events, Claudia Urea, Dr. Urea, who leads our pre-K-12 practice, had convened a group, and we were trying to imagine possibilities. And we drew upon this particular example that Angie Belcher, a professor at MIT, and I had been thinking about when we were thinking about developing a proposal. And this is imagining, a kind of activity for school children who are connected on the network in various schools around this country, who, let's say, were developing a payload for the next mission to Mars, and thinking about that as a project over time, and how exciting that would be, because it draws upon various things about these children discovering various artifacts, debating amongst themselves as to what represents a spaceship Earth-WEL to to those who are extraterrestrial, or to other to others in space. What might we collect? What might we preserve? How might we describe the artifacts that we collect? So the project actually, how might we analyze some of the specimens that we collect? So it had science, it had argumentation, all these elements that you see, and considering that there'll be kids from around the world, the platform that allowed them to do this would have translation features, collaboration features. And why an activity like this would be important, because it would be purposeful. It was driven towards the goal of generating this payload that could be taken, and it would be aspirational. Imagine, we would be sending information about the kinds of things that we care about, so that somebody else outside will learn about Spaceship Earth. So we had imagined a project like this. And so this is one case in point. And why I point to this is because it points to the kinds of capabilities. When we think about STEM, Kelly in her introduction talked about STEM being more than a word or more than a topic or subject. What we're really talking about is the kinds of tendencies, the learning behaviors, the learning pathways that we want to provide to children and adults. And we actually see STEM as a proxy term for these kinds of competencies and skills, things that refer to problem solving, collaboration, risk taking, finding different pathways into new knowledge and old knowledge. So these are the competencies. This bundle of competencies is what we see as STEM education. I have a URL at the end, because last night when I was thinking about this, about space, about this topic, about this event, I got reminded of a project that a group of mine had done with Professor Deva Newman. And I didn't pull out slides for that, but this was several years ago. Deva Newman, as some of you might know, was the assistant director of NASA till a few years ago. She's currently the head of the media lab at MIT, and one of the notable engineers in the world now. And Deva had developed this project with a group of us to create an interactive visualization. She had designed a space suit for female astronauts, but the interactive visualization where students manipulated this female astronaut, which was trying to balance herself in microgravity, out in space, and several of the movements were counterintuitive, because when you're grappling there, it's not like you're going this way, you're going that way. And it was based on some PhD research that was going on at the time. But what it really brought out was so many elements that are STEM education, principles of the conservation of angular momentum, how microgravity influences our body movements, mass movements, and so on. So all these is to point out the kinds of competencies and skills that we attribute to this notion of STEM education. I am just going to call it good, high quality learning. So when we think about the future, envisioning the future, there's a guidelines. It's well, people going on space camps, being able to do these kinds of collaborative activities, being able to conjure up situations, risk all these. It sort of sets us to think about who this new learner is. We have to have some sense of envisioning the new learner. And this is, I call it the new learner, but this is not the new learner of tomorrow, but the new learner of today. We see them. They are networked. They're discovering information on the internet. They are discovering communities on the internet with whom they are collaborating. They are looking at sometimes I say a morass, abundance of information, and trying to synthesize this information, or at least they need the capabilities of synthesizing what might be disparate elements around particular topics. They engage in creative thinking, critical thinking, problem-solving behavior. They think about the fact that there are many elements to solving a problem. Systemic thinking, that a system is a collection of interrelated parts working towards, like I pointed out in the Mars objective, working towards a purposeful end, connected, but towards a goal. They have some sense of themselves in relation to others, in relation to the earth, which is the compassion. It's not about coding. They have computational fluency. They navigate different UIs. They do problem solving. They understand the language, the grammar of computing, the implications of computing, or they need to. So when we think about the new learner, these are the kinds of competencies and skills that we imagine. How do we imagine the new teacher? I have made a reference to fly-by-wire. The metaphor that I want to draw upon when we envision the new teacher is that of a modern-day pilot. The term, the fly-by-wire project, is a project that my colleague, Professor Karen Wilcox, who's now actually who's a professor of aeronautics also at MIT, who's now leading a major research facility at UT Austin. She and I were co-PIs of a project, Department of Education project, which she called fly-by-wire. The reference was the fact that many of the planes nowadays are flown automatically, they're controlled automatically. And the reference to the modern day pilot is a metaphor for a teacher. A modern day pilot is sitting there in the cockpit. They're getting all kinds of data about weather conditions, about the runway, from the instrumentation. They have myriads of instrumentation all around them. They're getting data on every conceivable thing. God forbid, on data on the passengers sitting also. But they are also interpreting this data and trying to analyze this data and bringing the tools at their disposal. In the case of the teacher, it could be simulations, visualizations. Here they have various controls. And the modern day pilot is utilizing these tools to interpret the data and take action so that they can land this plane, read student, safely under diverse weather conditions. This is to acknowledge the fact that different students encounter different learning experiences. They have different aspirations, they have different motivations, they have differentiated preparations. And the intent of the teacher is to land each one of these students, learners, successfully, to have their experience be successful. And hence, when you imagine a new teacher, it's someone who interprets this data, analytics, who can act on this data, who can bring the tools at her disposal, whether they're technology tools or actions based on learning sciences, or both, act as a coach, act as a learning engineer to provide successful learning experience of the students. So I offer these as images of the future learner and the future teacher. And when we look at what's going on today, the kinds of competencies that are involved, these things become very, very, I should say, self-apparent. And we say, well, look, I mean, these are the kinds of competencies that are needed. Now, we've been trotting this out for about 4 years, saying, look, 6 years, look, and all these are familiar, not only familiar images, the landscape around us about marketplace, the labor economy, the kinds of competency skills that are needed in the workplace. Amazon is no longer moving it's not just a truck moving from point A to point B, it's a software service. You have Uber. It's no longer a transportation business alone, it's a software service. In fact, a good colleague, friend of ours, gave this example, which really struck home with me. He said, look, Vijay, when we were studying geography, we looked at atlases, we look at maps. Those things became a million images on Google. Today, they are an intelligence service on my wristwatch, a GPS-based service on my wristwatch. So in some sense, every hard product is being transformed into a soft, intelligent service. Think about the implications of that for the kinds of skills, the competencies that are required to produce that, to operate that, to take advantage of that, and extend the possibilities of that product space. What you see on the left is, the translation earbuds. They have implications. They change the nature of what the workforce looked like. More importantly, and germane to our topic here, they change the nature of what we learn, how we learn, what we teach, and how we teach. So the workforce, and this is not one of the things that I want to point out, the increasing centrality of digital is certainly a very significant force in these changing competencies, but it's not always a reaction that we are taking on. In many cases, we leverage technology for the kinds of richness, opportunities it creates. On the right on the screen, you see this example of Newport News. This is an extract from one of my colleagues' books, George Westerman, who leads a workforce learning practice in J-WEL in our lab. And he gives this example of Newport, the shipbuilding yard, where you have welders, you have fitters who are welding and fitting these plates, who didn't have any idea of what they were doing. The failure rate was high. They thought they came in, they plugged, they did not know that if they put in a screw wrong or if a weld wrong, what impact it had on subsequent parts of the production line. And moreover, they didn't even know what they were working for. Them, their job was about coming and fixing a plate to another plate. This was discovered, and the management brought in augmented reality headsets and so on, so that these welders could see what was happening as they drilled holes, as they put on the screws, as they welded these. They could see the impact of it on subsequent plates, the adjustment, how much it mattered. And what's more, they realized that they were part of building this mammoth thing, an aircraft carrier, a big tonnage boat. And so the result was not only did failure rates drop dramatically, the morale of the workers improved, because suddenly they experienced this totality of the work that they were doing, the comprehensive nature of the work they were engaged in. So you can see that technology is leveraging and the shift in competencies. So you say, well, and suddenly you're thinking about the kinds of competencies that you have to have in what you used to call a welder, a worker, a fitter, because so that they can take advantage of these technologies for all kinds of positive results. So what my point was that many of these competencies, when you think about the new learner, the network learner, the new teacher, are certainly things, because the landscape around us, the labor market, the skill sets are changing. But there's also a new generation of learners, and we've always said non-traditional learners, the millennials, and so on. But when we think about this new generation of non-traditional learners, they are displaced learners, displaced not only because of social-political reasons like the Syrian crisis. We work a lot with refugees. I'll point to some examples. But people who might be vocationally displaced, not necessarily locationally displaced, because they're in jobs they're stuck in jobs, they need to upskill so that they can rise or even move out to other sectors. There are gig workers, people who are working from home. There are veterans returning. There are undertrained workers. So suddenly you have a whole bunch of you have a much more expanded definition of non-traditional learners. So our notion of changing our teaching practice, learning practice, and thinking about who the learner is, what kinds of competencies, all these competencies that we talked about, has suddenly changed because of forces like this. So we have been talking about this for some time now. And what I say is in 2020 BC, before COVID, we said, oh, these are important to do because this is how the world is shifting. Along comes COVID, and he said, whoa, this is no longer a nice to have. This is a necessity. It's a critical dimension of what learning needs to be. COVID brought a new criticality, a new urgency, to the importance of these kinds of competencies, of kinds of learnings. We found out that we had to move, certainly, to provide these kinds of learning opportunities. But it also brought up new challenges. It said, look, we need to think about how to reach learners whom we have not been able to access hitherto. We have to displace, everyone is becoming displaced learner because they're operating from home. So it added a new dimension. It brought new dimensionality to all these things that we were looking at hitherto as being important and nice to have: continuity, inclusion, equity, and quality for all. And quality is, I use, and certainly this is what we have been hearing right from Kelly's intro, the term STEM is a proxy for all these quality learning tendencies, opportunities that we want to have. We all rushed, I think, valiantly and quite successfully as education institutions of different kinds to manage the transition, to preserve continuity in operations so that a whole generation did not get totally lost. But we moved to the transition with, I'm going to say valiantly, with mixed success because it opened our eyes to some realities. But what we are talking about is the period of transition was something we had to endure. What we really have to think about is the transformation that is needed because the new landscape demands it. And we are beholden to provide for the new landscape of opportunity. So it all seems very daunting. Oh my God, new skills, new people, new learners. I'm an optimist. We are futurists. We are all in the business of constructing preferred futures as educators, engineers, as ecologists, as systems thinkers. And I offer you the comfort, and you all know this, that on the supply side, there is relief. And in my mind, we have some of these forces that I've listed: the digital learning innovation, the integrated science of learning, the open movement, and what we have begun to realize quite significantly, a whole new ecosystem that we can leverage on the supply side, working with us in order to address that significant challenge and opportunity, which was the demand side that we talked about so far. Now, here is where, when I think about digital learning innovation, we say, look, this is not a matter of taking what you did and putting it online. We have seen that every aspect of the learning chain has been prone to and subject to innovation. A lecture is no longer a lecture, need not be a traditional 50-minute lecture. It can be a 6-minute video segment, followed by some formative testing, analysis, followed by some, a visualization which might explain some difficult, fuzzy concepts better, or speak to different multisensory learning. It could be some popping out to another resource. It could be a virtual lab, a virtual internship that you participate in. So digital learning, when we say it is about creating augmented reality, virtual reality environments, where teachers might prepare in advance for some of the situations that might be confronted in the classroom, whether it is math remediation, math aversion, or other social emotional issues. So and we have data. So all this is in the realm of what we say, the innovative possibilities created by digital learning. It is not about the invention, the technology part, but the applications that bring different kinds of possibilities in order to amplify some things that we care about. At MIT, we say, men's at Manas, we care a lot about practice, hands-on experiences. How can we bring these experiences to audiences who are remote? How do we not compromise the value of high engagement, high practice, the research orientation, bringing the joy, the practice, the tools of research into learning? How do we use technology innovatively to not sacrifice but amplify those value items and extend it to audiences that we typically don't serve? That's the realm of digital learning innovation. The second force, integrated science of learning. How do we learn? And when we say integrated, I'll say more about this shortly, from discipline-based education, research, from brain science, cognitive science, what are we learning about learning that allows us to respond to different kinds of learning behaviors, to different kinds of learners? And of course, how might we leverage the open movement? Again, not just as open content. How might we bring the value of extending this to the open movement? In 2000, MIT launched OpenCourseWare, made the content of all its courses available on the web for educational purposes to the world. What was significant was 250 institutions formed the OpenCourseWare Consortium after that to share their content. There are different kinds of open education initiatives that have been launched since then. How do you leverage those dimensions of open technology, open architecture, licensing regimens that have been created, like Creative Commons policy, and bring that along with the digital learning innovation, digital learning and technologies, which allows us to implement at scale what we learn from the integrated science of learning in order to meet these new demands of the new landscape that is needed. And the last thing is around the new ecosystem for learning. We found out that there are different players. We need, as academic institutions, for instance, we do not have to sacrifice what we value, but we don't have to be the sole providers of the value. Simple example, we believe a lot in practice. Maybe partner with some industry, a startup, in order to provide those kinds of experiences. I work with them collaboratively and do that. Can we shift the production of certain things to other players? Can we look at collaboration sectors? We are actually launching schools. There's a school in Belize that we're launching where we're looking at partnerships between industry, TVETs, the government, in order to provide these new kinds of experiences. So there's a whole ecosystem. And during COVID times, we see these things emerge where different partners were coming into play on whom we had to rely as part of the value chain of providing good learning experiences to our learners. So these are the forces that we have, which lead us to the kind of disruptive change. And I will say more about that term disruptive shortly. Science of learning. So these are practices that have, I talked about science of learning. There is so much that we knew over 100 years, and again, so much that we didn't know. That one of short-term formative testing helps learning. The idea of looking at these findings from learning science. In fact, this is a very interesting chart when you say we always just talk about learning curves, but we rarely talked about forgetting curves. And the idea was with spaced learning, interleaved learning, the slope of the forgetting curve is reduced. So if you look at a normal forgetting curve, it has a steep slope, which means that the stuff that you learn over periods of time, the drop-off factor is very high as compared to when you have spaced learning with experiments, with time away, with different kinds of interjections. The slope is much more gentle. Implication, and again, if you look at the chart, that recall of facts that you learn over time is improved through spaced learning. This we learn from learning science. How can we bring this in the design of our courses and materials. So there's a whole bunch of things that we can draw upon in order to construct the kinds of learning experiences that we want to meet the needs of different kinds of learning situations and of different kinds of learners. And this integrated science of learning, we draw from a variety of fields: discipline-based education, research, cognitive science, brain science. In fact, at MIT, we have launched a whole new initiative called the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative, which does research, which brings these areas into play together so that it might inform the practice of learning, inform the design of new kinds of learning experiences. What this kind of attention to the science of learning allows us to do is to judiciously combine on-site and online learning for different kinds of situation. There are some kinds of situation, like I pointed on the earlier, where short-term formative, frequent formative testing is difficult in the classroom. You can do those kinds of experiences better online. Short online videos for elaboration on some lectures or for some point lectures are better. So what it allows us to do is to apply technology, but more importantly, look at judicious combinations of on-site and online to to create the new kind of learner, to equip the new teacher that we want. So what does a new landscape driven by new digital learning innovation that draws upon learning sciences, that leverages open, what does it look like? So what I have on the screen are many initiatives that have been launched over time. Some of these that you know from things like App Inventor and Scratch, which millions of people, children particularly, are using around the world to engage in constructive learning experiences. You know, the kinds of experiences that we said the new network learner needs to have. We are looking at virtual internships, something that got pronounced attention during COVID times. We are looking at now one of our J-WEL's partners, members, Intelligent Machines Lab, is looking at how can we develop different kinds of AI-driven pathways on open courseware content to provide different learning pathways for different kinds of skills. Cynthia Brazil, who's a professor in the Media Lab, now coming in and working with us in open learning, has the AI education site, which I'd encourage you to see, which is looking at AI literacy in K through 12, a variety of AI-based applications, all the way from for social emotional learning to scaffold learning practices in schools for better math, more engaged math teaching. Then something that I like to point out, which is the MicroMasters a MicroMasters program. I hope you can still see this. Can you see the screen? All right. The MicroMasters program, which for me actually tells you, which is a real important example of what this new landscape of learning opportunities can look like, where you say, look, you don't have to get admitted in order to get quality education. There are courses in supply chain management, in finance, albeit this is driven for professional education largely, but you can see the extension of the concept to other sectors also. Yeah, we have all kinds of high quality courses that anybody in the world can take for free. You do not have to get admitted to any particular institution. If you want a particular kind of credential, then there are procedures. There, perhaps a fee or some payment involved. But it inverts the notion of admission. You do not have to be admitted in order to get access to high quality learning opportunities. You disaggregate, allows different kinds of disaggregation that makes learning opportunity, and that's a spirit of open. So you're able to provide, so these are examples how we look at our distributed credentials using blockchain technology. So this new landscape presents examples of what I have talked so far about how do you leverage digital learning opportunities informed by learning science, where they have ecosystem partners and that you're able to leverage the power of open in order to provide new kinds of radically different learning opportunities for quality at scale. I talk, when we have a center for virtual reality, which is exploring the future of learning through virtuality. I mentioned this particular thing from our partner, the Gyan platform. So this is what we do at the World Education Lab. We bring digital learning assets, innovation. We bring the power of all these things that I talked about. We engage with the community of collaborators who are our members in order to launch initiatives, so that we can co-construct, explore, design initiatives, projects that will transform institutions, that will do capability and capacity building, that will transform regions, so that quality learning opportunities of the new kind for this new generation can be made extensively available. So I've just listed out, and I'll apologize for some of this, a little bit of PR, if you will, but this is more to give you the kinds of initiatives that I talked about when I talked about the fact that there are new non-traditional learners, the work that we're doing with refugees in Jordan, okay, or to inform the development of the WHO Academy, so that millions of people, paraprofessionals, paraeducators can be educated, transforming universities. I talked about Full Steam Ahead. This initiative provides STEAM lab experiences to children over COVID. This was an extensively distributed sets of resources from J-WEL that was sent out to various learners in this country, around the world. So this is just to give you a sense of some of the kinds of initiatives that have been launched, which speak to the kind of aspirations that I talked about. This is Full Steam Ahead. So we've seen a picture of the possibilities, and these are all things that are happening. But I think as we think about design considerations for the future, we have some, I talked about the new learner, the new teacher, the new landscape of learning, the possibilities, initiatives. I think it is important for us to just reflect for a moment on the past year, what we saw. We had these aspirations over the past year, but it was very, very instructive what we went through, what we learned, and to see what of the things that we saw are sticky that we need to keep, what do we really need to modify because it was less than desirable. And so constructing the future, this is an important message for me that I always try to communicate, that as we are thinking and imagining and inventing and co-inventing the future, it is really, really important for us to think, what is it that we want to keep, that we want to value? And in that sense, I ask that we all take a moment to reflect on the past year. What we learned very strongly was access and equity are not interchangeable terms. That access, we created access, we created online opportunities, but we saw, and this has been written about, reported extensively, and this was not just about infrastructure and physical connectivity. It was the fact that people, as learners and teachers, were ill-prepared or not equally prepared to take advantage of offerings online or of remote learning for a variety of reasons. The home situation was not conducive to learning. There was a lot of social emotional needs that needed to be met. And so access and equity cannot be confused. Now, on the positive side, we did see, and amongst our own students, in the various connection gatherings that we had in J-WEL, that the disposition towards digital had definitely improved or changed. There was much more receptivity, acknowledgement of the increasing centrality of digital, and the value it provided in terms of flexibility, in terms of broader participation in some cases, the fact that people could do this intelligent kind of flipping, judicious combination of on-site. We also noticed that this heavy reliance on formative testing, end of year exams was diminishing. People started seeing the value, and we have actually researched to substantiate that about low stakes formative assessment, how it has led in many cases to improved mastery, better learning outcomes. So certain elements of pedagogy and practice where there was more resistance or reluctance to have become more acceptable, more adopted. There's a tendency to adopt them. We also found out that we had a lot of blind spots that we were overlooking. We forgot what co-location, coexistence at schools was about well-being, about social emotional learning. We assumed that teachers could turn on a dime to become facilitators. We forgot about we also forgot that there were a whole bunch of new actors. There's a wonderful picture. There's an organization called EDC, Educational Development Center. I'm one of the trustees there, and I was watching a presentation, and this wonderful spot of interactive radio being delivered for education over COVID times. But what was significant about the photograph was that there was a parent there between the radio and the child who was learning. Parents, other para educators we have realized, and COVID taught us that they've become important actors in the value chain of learning. How do we prepare them? I know technologists were thinking about tutoring, AI-based individual tutors, so that these para educators, or in the case of the WHO Academy, paramedical professionals can be better equipped to serve their role in the learning value chain. So these are the kinds of things that that when we think about the year ahead, and I think it's important to think about that so that we actually construct better preferred futures. And out of that, so that we can build back better. And you see all kinds of possibilities where we can, and I just talked about these, how we need to think about employing technologies like AI, like we are, to provide differentiated learning opportunities to people who are differently abled. I like to say that we are all disabled or differently able learners. Some have math deficiencies, some have hearing impairment. The universal condition is of being differently abled. Similarly, that all learners are displaced, some geographically, some locationally, some vocationally. So our design, it will get reflected in the design consideration that we think about differentiated learning opportunities. And about how we prepare the ecosystem better to generate this future learning opportunities to respond to the new landscape. Summarizing, what are the key high-level design considerations for this preferred future? Think all learners everywhere, like I just emphasized, displaced, differently abled, and differently enabled. We have to think, and this is what certainly the last year taught us, the last 6 years and the rapid pace, and then the fact that space travel is no longer just a professional vocation, but could well become an amateur avocation, that the future is fluid. Like I said, like Yogi Berra famously quoted, it ain't what it used to be. So we have to anticipate, and this is learning for life versus learning for class. And there's an important point I'd like to make over here. When we think, there's a lot of conversation about employability, about skills. We talk about learners going integrated learning from early childhood to higher education to adult learning. I think we have to move away from the notion of generating people who will take jobs to people who will generate opportunities. And that mind shift is what gets reflected as good STEM education, in my humble opinion, to think about people who create opportunities, that entrepreneurship is not about creating entrepreneurs. That is one goal, but to have people who have entrepreneurial tendencies, risk-taking, discovery. Again, those are what we think about as STEM competencies. Thinking about change systemically, that's an important design consideration for the preferred future. thinking that there are various parts. We have to create individual capability and institutional capacity, the various actors, the systemic orientation to change, and recognizing all along that there's a new ecosystem. So I said I'd come back to the term disruptive change, disruptive innovation. We all experience a lot of inventions, a lot of innovative applications. And when we look and take, do a critical report card, a lot of these innovations are the edge. When we talk, at least when I talk about disruptive innovation, we are talking about affecting the structural relationship between the actors and factors in producing and delivering education. We pointed out when we talked about distributed credentials, disaggregation. You separate admissions from learning. You separate learning from credentials, learners from institutions. So the structural relationship between things that have been considered hitherto immutable, the iron triangle, as Sir John Daniels, when he talked about open education, referred to, they are rendered mutable, different kinds of structural relationships. And it is that kind of disruptive innovation that we are talking about that will allow us to meet the new needs of the new landscape, generate new learners and new kinds of teachers. And, again, just to reiterate, we have these wonderful forces of the supply side, which can lead to the kind of disruptive innovation that will allow us to really produce quality at scale, where scale, like I like to say, is not a scalar, but a vector, serving different kinds of people with different aspirations, motivation, preparation, challenges, opportunities, so that we can really change the world of learning and the world through learning. So with that, I will stop. I thank you for being a very patient audience. I'm happy to take any questions, or as always, I'll take Kelly's instruction. Thank you.
Be here. Here I am. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great. Thank you. And we were just commenting on that last slide. That's a wow slide. So thank you so much. As always, it's a pleasure there. And there was just, I know we're at this time limit here, but what can we do to encourage disruptive innovation in schools? Like, what could administrative support look like there?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Well, there's a simple thing, and we all talk about this, Kelly. We can be more accepting. We can embrace failure as not defeat. So we like to say, I've seen the enemy, and the enemy is me. I think we can change our tendencies towards failure and not look the typical vibes that we have around the finality of learning, that it's progression. I think we have to, structurally, we have to incentivize experiments. All of education. My research work was in educational innovation, in introducing technology for innovation in developing countries. And typically, education, we say, if you do X, Y will follow. Right? We do these. We'll have to allow ourselves time for these so-called failures. That's one thing. So to encourage disruptive innovation, it's simple. We have to be encouraging and appreciative of what we used to call constructive bugs, failures from which we can learn. Right? I think that is the other thing that I find we did a lot of in some projects where we worked with teachers. This was at 1,100 schools in India, for STEM education. And when we did design experiences, I think it's important for us as teachers to work with our students, with our learners. So we come onto a common threshold. That is disruptive. So because it is about It is about changing a lot of power relationships.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you for taking that as some of these comments were saying. It's changing a culture always takes time. And
actually, if I may comment on that, I think that whoever said that is such just one last comment on that, because we all talk about cultural change. I keep liking to point out, it's not a binary switch that your cultural change is not, you don't switch it on, switch it off. But I always said that cultural change is always retrospective. You apply a change and you keep practicing it consistently. More and more people do it. And you look back and you say, oh my God, the culture has changed. You do not drive towards a cultural change. You change the practice. You stay with it. You stay with it till it becomes a positive addiction. And then you look back and you say, my God, we've changed.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I love hearing that too, because you're right. We so often just hear that as this, changing the culture. But again, what does that mean, right? It's that consistency piece. So, well, I want to take this opportunity from the bottom of my heart to just thank you. It's just always a pleasure. And again, we just, look forward to continuing this learning journey together. And again, for anyone, if you have questions there, just please feel free to send them. We're always happy to get them. And you will find that Dr. Kumar is just one of the most down-to-earth, accessible folks that you'll ever meet. So please don't hesitate to send any questions our way if there's further discussion.
Absolutely. And please do send it our way. Keep in touch with me, with our lab. Kelly, thank you for putting together such an important event. Your timing could not have been better. And this is a journey, and we're all in this together. Say, let's launch forth.
That's right. Here we go. All right. Thank you so much.
Take care.
All right, everyone. We're going to now jump into our next session, where we're going to hear from our major STEM associations. So if you just jump over to the agenda, you can click on to the next session there. So I'll see everyone in just a moment.